Today we will be reviewing a very cute study that was published just last year that you may have heard of from social media already, which asks, do bumblebees play? So wait a second, this seems like a bit of a silly question. We already know that a single bee by itself is not much outside of its hive. We also associate play with sentience, so why even ask this? In the 21st century, researchers have come to interesting conclusions involving invertebrates. Remember, these are animals without backbones. Like how in 2016, we observed that cephalopods, that is, octopuses, cuttlefish, and squids, engage in play-like behavior. Also, in regarding to bees, in 2016, we observed that bees exhibit a positive emotion-like state in association with dopamine. So, why not investigate play behavior in bees? To define play, researchers have already come up with a list of 5 criteria that must be met in order for an animal's behavior to be classified as play. The researchers of this study used this criteria to compare their results to see if the bumblebees exhibit play-like behavior. The first is to not be related to survival strategies of function, like food, mating, and shelter. This must be non-functional behavior that does not become an obvious outcome. The second is to be an action that's voluntary. So the animal cannot be taught to do this behavior. They must do it voluntarily and find it rewarding. The third is the actions are different from functional behavior. The fourth is that the action must be repeated but not stereotyped. What this means is it can't be a one-off chance occurrence, and it cannot also be a habitual tick. Finally, the behavior must be initiated under stress-free conditions. We find from previous research that play seems to be a pleasant phenomenon, and it comes to a pause when an animal is stressed. They studied the bumblebee species, Bombus terrestris, which is common in Europe. They observed how bumblebees would interact with the balls to see if they would exhibit play-like behavior. There are 3 experiments. The first wondered if bees would roll the balls. The second looked at if age affected ball rolling, and the third tested to see if the bees would voluntarily choose a room containing the balls. So this is just a bird's eye view of the setup itself. So here we can see this is a nest, and the bees would come out and they would either go to sucrose, which is be their food, or pollen, and they would call this behavior foraging. And this path to the foraging area is unobstructed. However, over here is an object area consisting of mobile and immobile balls, and they wanted to see if bees would go over to this area and play with them. Then, for the third study, they had the nest, but instead they made sure that there was a room with balls and one without, and they would associate the yellow room with the balls. And then they would, of course, have foraging behavior over here. Then they would have bees that were taught and not taught about the ballroom, and neither of them would contain the balls. And they wanted to see if bees would choose the room based off if they remembered if it had balls or not. So the results you can see for yourself. So the results showed that the bees indeed did roll the balls. For the third experiment, the bees chose the ballroom when taught about it. The blue ones did not have a preference, but the yellow ones chose the yellow room because they thought it would contain balls. And then they found that young bees tend to engage in play or roll the balls a lot more than older bees. They interestingly also found that drones rolled balls more than non-drones. Now, back to our 5 criteria, we see that the rolling was unrelated to survival strategies. Bees typically don't roll balls in the wild. Rolling itself was rewarding to the bees as they sought it over and did it multiple times, as we can see with the bees that were taught that the yellow room meant balls. Rolling differed from typical motor patterns like we see from pollination or, say, a drone mating with the queen. Rolling was repeatable, but it wasn't predictable. Finally, the study was conducted in a stress-free environment. Now for our takeaways. The decrease in play over age matches what we see with other mammals. When we are younger, our brains are still developing, and play is a helpful way for our brains to develop to learn about our surroundings and see what our capabilities are. The observation that drones play more may be due to bee biology. The researchers propose that the drone's function is to mate with the queen. They do not supply food for the colony. Perhaps the drones have more free time, so less motivation to stop ball rolling. The idea of the getting value from play suggests a form of sentience. Overall, our idea of insect consciousness is still changing, and further research will help update our view on insects and maybe even learn a little bit about our own brain development.